Welcome to Gradient Proof, a long-form discussion on a range of topics from AI to philosophy to entrepreneurship. We start each podcast sober and let the proof gradient the course of discussion. As always, we encourage you to drink with us. Welcome to The Gradient.
Hello, welcome everybody for another podcast of Gradient Proof. I'm here with my co-host Roy Peer in sunny Tampa, Florida. We usually record these in New York, but this is our first off-campus recording. Today we're going to be talking about Max Tegmark's Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. This was published in 2017, however, has been a seminal work in the discussion of artificial intelligence more generally. Max Tegmark continues to be a professor at MIT, where he focuses on AI and mathematics.
Absolutely. Great. So, Stephen, where would you like to jump in?
Well, let's kind of lay out a little bit what he means by this phrase, Life 3.0, right? And what he does is he kind of sets the book up looking at the evolution of life more generally, and does that looking at how life has evolved over our planet, certainly, and life in the universe, right? And for him, he kind of breaks it into these different categories. One is Life 1.0, which is kind of the most simple and biological form of life. And that is kind of similar to what we would consider a bacteria, wherein this kind of has its own DNA, certainly. It will replicate to what that DNA tells it to do. Within a broader environment, it can evolve, but it wouldn't evolve within its own lifetime. That DNA will kind of continue from beginning to end, providing the instruction for how that life in its most simple form will operate. And then he kind of goes further in talking about this idea of Life 2.0, right? And Life 2.0 is kind of where we exist as a human species, right? We're born. We also have DNA that very much dictates, how we will be on a functional basis, and we are able to grow as a species culturally, right? In terms of the creation of language, sports, and other professional cultures that will allow us over the course of our lifetime to kind of improve upon what we know, while our kind of DNA life instruction remains the same. But while we can kind of make these improvements to kind of our software, what we carry around in our head, right? The kind of the hardware, if you will, very much kind of remains the same. And then he talks about Life 3.0 is kind of a further evolution of the species, and that is the ability to kind of have control of those educational and quote-unquote software-like dimensions, but also hardware-like dimensions, and wherein we could have the ability, again, whether it be modifying our own DNA, whether it be, maybe cyborg implants, whether it be being able to extend beyond the original parameters of our birth, in terms of thinking about different hardware limitations. Right.
So, Stephen, just so we have a little bit of context,
Sure.
Do you know when this book initially came out? When it was initially?
Sure. And it came out in 2017.
2017. So, I mean, if we throw it into the context of where technology was there, right? 2017, you're looking at it about 10 years since the iPhone came out, right? And then fast forward to today, 2023, you've got one of the fastest growing applications of all time, essentially ChatGPT, that, I think for the first time has really shown people what an AI can do in a more useful form that could has broad strokes across all different types of industry, right? And then you've also got, obviously, from OpenAI, you've got DALL-E and all these other image generation softwares. And there's a few interesting things I think will tie together. But when I first kind of thought of or read through these ideas of the stages of life 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, it kind of lends itself to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So on the lowest level, you could call life 0.0, it's, simple and biological. It's how do you create a way to survive in the environment that you're placed in? And on a human level, you could say, once you've built the log house that protects the wolves and the bears from getting in, how do you think about decorating that log house, making it work, and also maybe not decorating, but thinking about life now that you don't have to think about avoiding the exterior elements and environment. So, I think that's what's interesting here is the technology itself also adapts from this kind of lower level shelter and eventually works its way up, the concept pyramid there to this self-actualization, right? So it might be now that the tools we see are kind of instruments to then assist us in, kind of more the middle stages, and then eventually gets you to self-actualization. And I think that's what some of the frameworks that AI has spoken about, which is how do you, build a system that becomes self-aware that then can, solve questions and ideas and problems much more quickly. But of course, with the underlying risk of what does that mean for those who create it, right? And, we've talked about this a little bit in the book, but the idea of, AI being kind of, we're building essentially a caterpillar that will eventually cocoon and develop into a butterfly. So, once you're a butterfly, some of the attributes of the caterpillar are no longer an issue, right? You don't build, landlines in a new country. You just go straight to cellular, and the infrastructure there is kind of different and adaptive to the new technology, not referencing the old technology that helped you get to that new technology. So I think those are kind of some interesting overarching arcs. If you'd like, Stephen, we could jump into maybe some examples you want to pull out, or we could do a really quick deep dive into what we think ChatGPT and AI as a whole, and maybe how those different things come together.
Sure, absolutely. And I think we can definitely do a combination of both, where, right now we can kind of think about where we exist kind of in what I think Max would describe as a cruder form of maybe life 2.3 or 2.5. Right? That is that we all walk around with our cell phone in our pocket, right? That for all intents and purposes gives us access to an infinite world of information, right? Now, this isn't necessarily quote unquote integrated. It's not a Neuralink, right? Directly, making this information available to you within your mind itself, which would kind of be more of a Life 3.0 example, right? But it's certainly kind of along that evolution, as you say, of making the dissemination and consumption of knowledge, right, further and further available. Right, and allowing people to kind of evolve, right, within their very being of not just culturally, but soon perhaps even physically as well, right? And to that, yes, I mean, circling back to ChatGPT, right? What does it begin to now perhaps even hint at, right? On what potentially could be coming down the pipe in terms of, meaningful AI, maybe not necessarily artificial general intelligence, but limited intelligence, having a more and more direct, personal interaction with our lives in the next 10 years.
Right. And I think one thing that sometimes, at least for myself, is hard to forget. You live and exist within the status quo, and there are technological changes that change the way we do X, Y, and Z. But you may become comfortable with the current state of affairs. Like, a few years back, 2-day shipping may have been something that was out of the ordinary, but now it's so commonplace, you can almost forget what life was like before it. Same with cell phones, not going to a phone booth to make a call. And these things kind of get, baked into the reality, right? So I guess what's interesting is, how do we look at the stage of, let's say, going back to 2007 when the iPhone initially came out, and the developments it's made forward as far as information processing, being able to access information, capture information, and play and manipulate that within the palm of your hand. So if we're looking today, and this is the 2007 of this ChatGPT and all these other different features that are now currently kind of separated, right? Where does this end up, 10, 20, 30 years, and adversely 200 years from now, when these things are so integrated to the current systems, you could see it going leaps and bounds. So, I think something that may be a little fun is to kind of, guess and ponder on what those things mean. So, if I wanted to go and be bombastic or crazy, I could say that, today, one of the current systems, when you want to sit down and enjoy some entertainment, you may open Netflix. You're looking at these highly produced, or just produced generally pieces of episodes or movies, series, things of that nature. And each of those were kind of with a long time horizon from when it was available for you to view and ingest, right? There's a lot of planning that goes into that. You need budgets to be approved, ideas, scripts, production, post-production, all of these different things to then create this piece of content that may be an hour or an hour per episode long. But, to some degree, you may sit there and after those, potentially thousands of man hours that have gone in to develop that, you may finish that hour and think to yourself, well, that was a waste of time, or that was the best thing I've ever seen, or there's so many different ways to look at that. So let's say we were to take just the current tools that we're seeing as far as AI, which let's point out to ChatGPT, so from a text generation standpoint, and then also DALL-E, which is an image generation standpoint. And then you could also, I guess, take in some of the AI technologies where if you upload somebody's, let's say, voice or them speaking, some certain amount of, dialogue, you can essentially have an AI analyze that and then have their same tones, the way that they speak, be baked into, or you could input any kind of text, and then it would generate that same type of nuance, speaking a text that they've maybe never said. So I guess what I'm getting at is in the future, I could see that everyone's Netflix is completely unique, and not unique in the selection, but the actual types of content that you're watching. So let's say on this particular day, you've had a tough day, you want something that's uplifting, and maybe you don't even have to let whatever this future Netflix is know, it would automatically generate that based on the input of your day. And if, let's say, fast forward, you've got some kind of brain interface that already knows that. So you sit down and you want to watch something, you're in fact watching exactly what you want to watch, not something that's recommended. There's no interface for a selection of different types of series and things like that. You're seeing exactly what you want to watch, and it'll deviate based on your reaction real time. So let's say you're watching a movie and you happen to really be fond of one of the characters. It could be that while you're watching it, the signals from your brain are communicating then with this generation machine or program that essentially will say, okay, he's focused more on this character and he kind of is anticipating this outcome. You could, to the degree where it makes sense and create something captivating based on, the way humans like to foresee an ending or unforesee an ending, it could take you on a wild ride of either allowing that to happen in real time or shifting it and surprising you depending on its idea of what you think or what you want as a surprise, right? So I think there's these like super interesting ways that content gets developed, information gets developed. So I also think there's a little bit of a fear here. If I wanted to sway somebody in one way or another, or introduce them to a different way of thinking, you could do that through slight nuances based on just how people typically interpret information and analyze and work off information. And you could, this could be from an advertising level or a larger political idea or whatever it might be, but you could slowly let in certain ideas through that AI generated that content. And I think there's a lot of power in that could potentially be misused, of course. But from an entertainment standpoint, I think could be really interesting that every show that you watch could be specifically tailored to you. The characters could be what in your mind you think is the right character for the place versus what some producers in a casting office decide it could potentially be of interest. And then if we, let's say you're going and you're watching it with your spouse and they've got their own way of looking at movies or things, there could be a hybrid where you get these movies that are built out so that it's both interesting and engaging to both parties or multiple parties that are actually watching something. So what does that potentially mean as far as the current industry, right? If you kind of create a way where you can generate actors or actresses through just a combination of all the previous data that we currently have, you essentially wipe out the whole industry currently of as far as celebrities and things of that nature or actresses and what extrapolates out of that. So I'm sure they wouldn't be very happy with that. But from an efficiency standpoint, to be able to build things out, you don't have to worry about an actor's schedule or their private plane request to and from the recording site or anything like that, because it would just be automatically generated and you're essentially just paying for the GPU, and the program that's already been built out. So I think we're going to see some pretty big disruptions there. And that's bound to come. And I think you've already got the ingredients. The question is who can put that together in a way that, produces and understands the viewer itself.
Yeah, no, definitely. And another big area, you talk about entertainment, but in a different consumption pattern that we all go through on our daily lives is news consumption, right? And what's interesting about that is when you think about it, the way we find and consume news today is inherently inefficient in a variety of different ways. One is you may use any number of news aggregators, but these aggregators are kind of unaware of both what you know, i.e. who you are as a historical person, right. What type of domain expertise do you have, and related to the topic itself, right? It further, in a similar fashion, it doesn't know the particulars of, are you reading an introductory article to this particular news event, or is this maybe the 10th, 20th, 30th, or 100th article you've read on a particular news event, right? And there, I think what becomes exciting in maybe the medium term is the ability for something like a GPT-3, a GPT-4, a ChatGPT to kind of further refine and develop news articles that are appropriate to your level of understanding of the topic, right? Which can be far more efficient from a time perspective and far more kind of enriching, going back to your idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, moving further and further up that pyramid, right, of not necessarily like base level understanding of a topic, but, understandings that become further and further refined and more nuanced, right, against other known data. Right.
I think what's interesting there is, and I think this is where we'll run into those set of issues as far as control, manipulation of information, is that when you have a news source or a channel that creates a certain type of content, right? Let's say it's being produced towards a target audience, right? And there isn't the manipulation on the personal level to drive them to think or do, certain things, because that information is not being. It's more of a broad kind of out outbound kind of distribution or broadcast, right? But when it does become more specified, and you could have people that are living in completely different realities that take up the same space and potentially exist in the same area, and just view the world very differently. And you could say that that happens today, right? If you read a certain set of books and someone else reads a completely different set of books, the way you view the world is potentially different. But when it comes to kind of there's one thing if there's a particular interest in a certain category, but a view of life events and political outcomes and things like that have bigger ramifications for the greater good of a larger society, right? So if you wanted to drive potentially a certain group of people slowly against another, you could probably do that very easily by just manipulating the information that they intake on a daily level, and it I guess that's what I would see as the most dangerous, because you could have somebody who thinks, the Black Mirror episode where this people are going around and they're hunting these zombies, and they're killing them because they believe they're demons or zombies or whatever it might be, and at some point, from what I remember, their goggles turn off for some reason, or they take the goggles off, and it's not really a zombie, but it's a mother and a child who are just living in a house somewhere, but may be deemed an enemy by whoever the creator of the goggle is, right? Mm. So, that filter manipulation is something you could see in a totally new form. Not to say that different governments manipulate data, create propaganda, but I think the ability to do it on such a individual level is something that I don't think we really fully understand at this point.
Sure.
So that's a little bit scary, but on an entertainment level, it would be pretty fun if you sat down and you were in the mood for an action movie, maybe a little bit scary, a little bit sexy, whatever it is, and that's exactly what you get. And it's fantastic every time. It's the best movie. It's the best show you've ever seen every single time. And it can do that because it knows what you saw before, what you liked. It follows your the beating of your heart, the different parameters from a internal perspective. So it may be that you don't even know that you would love it, but based on reading the data within the way your mind is reacting and your endorphins fire and things like that, you could then actually make something that is so incredibly great. So I think that'll be interesting. From a cultural level, that would be tough. I mean, there's also, you could go into the idea of warfare and what that means as far as being able to create AI systems that are then able to make decisions more quickly based on a certain set of rules. And I think the big question down the line is going to be, who's the person that's manipulating the filter and instructing those things? That's where I think the power will become increasingly outrageous.
Sure. To step back a little bit to what you were saying before, it's also interesting to think about ChatGPT or GPT in relationship to other things. So one of the experiences I've had recently is so ChatGPT from OpenAI, right, is based on a LLM, which is a large language model, right? And it has so many billions of parameters within it. A few years ago, they released GPT-2, then GPT-3 came out, and right now the Da Vinci sequence 3.5 is what is available through the OpenAI website. And then later this year, they're going to come out with GPT-4. But what's interesting is one of the differences between the LLM that GPT is that it doesn't have there are two different elements. One of it is the present version has information from the internet up to about 2021, right? So if you ask it questions after that time frame, it's a little bit more limited in its ability to respond because it's not part of the learning module. Now, the other thing too is when you have different types of conversations with it, its long or medium to long-term memory is quite limited by design, right? So you can continue to ask it to do, a variety of different text outputs, but it can only re-reference past conversation or past inputs to a limited extent. That information is just kind of being discarded as you go. What I found to be kind of interesting in the last couple of months, I've been working with another product called Personal AI. And Personal AI is an example of a PLLM or PLM, which is a personal language module. And the difference between GPT and this PLM approach is it's very much designed to structure, right, a language model around a facsimile of you and your interests, where you can continue to upload into it everything, say, your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your Twitter, right? Soon it will have whole Google Drive integrations, right? Articles that you find interesting. I've actually downloaded all our previous gradient proof podcasts into it, right? And at the beginning, right, the interaction with this thing is a little bit limited, right? But I find that week after week, right, maybe kind of uploading additional bits of information, maybe an hour, sometimes 2 hours a day, right? The personal language model becomes very, very sophisticated, right? In its ability to answer questions, for example, provide a personal SWOT analysis for Stephen. And then it will kind of demarcate, Stephen's strengths are, his weaknesses are, his opportunities are, his threats are, or provide a 5-year strategic plan for Stephen. And it will just kind of break that all out, right? And what's interesting is with more inputs inside the model, right, the nuance and the relevance of what it's putting out kind of enhances over time, right? In a way that is actually quite exciting, in the way that you can, kind of go back and forth and play around with the different thought experiments, et cetera, right?
Right. Absolutely. So, taking in that interior data, I mean, what's interesting is there's also this kind of collision between, the personal action and actual data, right? So you may get that SWOT analysis, and it may say your biggest threat is the fact that you go out on weekends and, X, Y, and Z, do this type of habit or that type of habit. And it might say, if you want to get wherever your goal is, and I'm guessing that SWOT analysis or whatever it might be, may be targeted to some kind of goal, right? Some people have, everyone is going to have different expectations. It's not only of themselves, but also their future self. So, there's also that resistance of, okay, if you take X, Y, and Z steps, you will statistically end up in this place in some number of time, date, whatever. And then there's also the resistance inside saying, I enjoy going out and doing this, or I enjoy, this part of my life or whatever it might be. So, and it could be interesting that it updates it and kind of makes an analysis based on your response to it, right? So, there's some things that we hear all the time, like someone may say, smoking is bad for you, and you will carry that with you every time you light a cigarette, but it's only when the doctor diagnoses you with lung cancer that really hits home, right? And maybe that's just an extreme example, but there's also that human element, which from a AI or a just functional level is potentially the biggest restriction, right? If someone asks, how do I make $1 billion? Well, it's sell X, Y, and Z thing for whatever the multiple of the cost and the amount you need to sell to then achieve that number, right? But it's the actual human element of able to actually get in there and orchestrate and facilitate those things without letting the doubt and the other human kind of emotions that may hold you back or set you back from taking hold of what you need to do, right? It's a transaction. It's sell X, Y, and Z this many times. Okay, but in order to do that, you've got to get past all these structures of, let's say, the business or whatever the outcome is, and it's typically the person that is in that human element of that's holding it back. So I think that's interesting. But given that it's a smart system and it would understand kind of your reaction to it, it could give you that cancer level diagnosis that isn't as serious, but delivered in a way that has the same habit changing instruction, right? And you can see that potentially in different ways of storytelling and framing and things of that nature. But I do think that's interesting, and if that did come into play, and how that would change people, right? There's also a question about, as you're learning and growing from a smaller age, if you had that available and you could lay it at the foundational level versus, let's say, a smoker of 30 years, you've got a way more pliable, kind of Plato-like way of viewing the world, where it's easier to kind of shape. Whereas later in life, you've kind of hardened those crystals in a way that are hard to chip away at.
Yeah, certainly, right. And it kind of introduces another topic, and that is, as these AI systems become more advanced, right? How do they interact with us over the course of our life, right? And what does that look like, right? Mm-hmm. Including to how does a personal AI system continue to exist, if it exists after, right, the end of the life of an individual, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that whether it be a family member, a close friend, or a spouse, a significant other, they pass away, but yet you have a very large input model of who they are and how they've been, right? That is, continually potentially referenceable and addressable, and maybe even evolvable, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Beyond that person's death, right? The question then becomes is, what sort of ethical questions might emerge wherein, should such a model be restricted, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way that, I believe that your medical data, right, is restricted under HIPAA even past the death of an individual, right? Mm-hmm. Should somebody be able to have access to what is a kind of a conversant chat reality, right, with something that has been trained up over decades, if not a lifetime of inputs, right? Mm-hmm. Almost an at best simulacrum of what that person was, right?
Right. And to tie back, what you mentioned earlier about having that conversation in a SWOT analysis. Yeah. I mean, it could be that the person you're speaking with or communicating with through the program could actually take on the life or the resemblance of somebody that was important to you in the past. You could use the archetype of a wise grandfather or grandmother who would then actually potentially jump in and potentially walk you through situations in a more calming way, right? Speaking to some of those human elements, right? Like if why would you select some generic voice of Siri when it could be someone you actually find interesting? Or let's say you're on some kind of conquest in a certain space. Let's say, this wouldn't be maybe the case, but you're an inventor and the AI chat that speaks to you is the voice of Edison, and maybe some of the nuances of how he would view a problem or think about a problem. So taking these kind of great minds and great ideas from all different parts of history, right, or the relevant history, to make it more monumental. I think there's also interesting thought experiments, and this is something I talk about in the simulation arcade. But if you could look at different different people who existed at different times and combine them, right? So I think there's something floating around now with Joe Rogan interviewing Steve Jobs on his podcast, and it's interesting because they're speaking based off that AI is generating the conversation, and it's in their voice and in kind of the way that they speak. But potentially going back even further and putting people at odds with each other, right? If you take a great capitalist and a great communist and put them in the room, even though they never lived in the same era, and not only that, maybe you introduce a new or the environment of today and have them analyze it through what you would think their frame of thinking of that time and find those incongruencies, right? So I think there's a lot of really creative, interesting ways that all of these things can be implemented. And then we've covered a lot of different projects that probably each would take a lot of time to develop. But when you have something like AI that could potentially even code itself, you could almost just instruct it potentially in the future to then create these things based off your imagination and creating these certain types of outcomes.
Yeah, certainly. And then going back to, because you had mentioned entertainment before, right? I was listening to a South by Southwest podcast about a week ago, right? Mm-hmm. And they were looking at, AI in the context of gaming, right? Mm-hmm. Video gaming, where particularly when we talk about the lifetime of an individual, we think that, children under the age of 10, right, may or not play some sort of video game, right, mm-hmm. And in the teenage years or college years, they may continue to do so. And, we live in an age where you also have adult gamers, right? And while in, typically when we think of AI in gaming, we think of it in to a far more limited degree. That is, the quote unquote NPC, non-player characters, mm-hmm. right? And what degree of coded sophistication they have as you interact with them, right? But one of the idea that was posited was that in the future, what you may have is evolving relationships with characters in games that almost go from game to game to game. And the example that was given was the example of none other than Mario, right? Mm-hmm. And what I thought was kind of quite humorous was the fact that you fire up a Super Mario game and or a variation of, and you'll often begin, "It's a me, Mario," right? And the person can say there's a certain level of frustration there because I've quote unquote known and been with Mario going way back to Donkey Kong in 1980, mm-hmm. but this gaming character doesn't seem to remember the hundreds, if not thousands, of hours we've spent together, mm-hmm. right? And there's no referenceability in that, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what if there was some sort of AI system that kind of grew, right? So as the years went on and you went from game to game to game, these characters would be characters that would be, as they became more and more sophisticated upon different experiences, different inputs, right? Mm-hmm. Different understandings of you, right? There is kind of a relationship there, if you will. Right.
Well, I think something that's interesting that you bring up here is, as let's say you started developing out that game, you would have connection to characters throughout time. There would be games that were more difficult or maybe a little bit easier to achieve. And I think what you would eventually end up with is another version of life itself. And, that's, I guess, you could say that what is it, NPCs, or those could, you could already live in a world where those already exist, and the only time they activate and give you more information is when you engage in them. One thing in gaming, just from a computational level, is you don't want to download an entire world right away. So what you do is you create levels of detail. So that essentially, like if there's a tree in the distance, you don't need it to build out the atoms in the tree. It just needs to be it just needs to convince you enough at that distance that it is a tree. And as you approach it, it starts to develop out the pixels or voxels or whatever.
Wait, there's more. To listen to the next part of this episode, please follow the platform catalog.